Hi everyone, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today is a crime day and I'm going to be doing a head-to-head between two books. The first one is The 20-Year Death by Ariel S. Winter. The second one, 5 Decembers by James Kestrel. Now, the reason I've decided to do this as a head-to-head style video rather than doing individual reviews of the books is that when I was reading them, and I've read them both in the last month or so, it occurred to me there's a lot of similarities between them. So they are both from Hard Case Crime, one of my favourite publishers. They are both modern novels, so if you don't know, Hard Case publish a lot of older, kind of reprints of older crime novels, but they also publish new stuff. So these are both modern ones. 5 Decembers came out this year, and The 20-Year Death came out, I think, in 2012. And they, despite being modern, are both written in a kind of classic crime style. And I'll talk a bit more about that when I get into the books, because certainly for The 20-Year Death, it's a very relevant fact. And the other thing to note with both of them is that they both take place over a prolonged period of time, as suggested in each case by the title. So crime novels are often quite compact in terms of the time frame that they cover, but these books both have an extended window, if you like. So 20-Year Death takes place over 20 years. So in 3 decades, so there's actually 3 separate books that make up the overall volume. So one set in 1931, one in 1941, and one in 1951. And 5 Decembers is set over the course of a 4-year period, so starting in December 1941 and ending December 1945. So as I say, a lot of similarities between the books, superficially at least, but a lot of differences as well. So let me get into it. I will talk briefly about the kind of plots and settings of each of the books, and then talk about the similarities and differences. Okay, so The 20-Year Death, as stated, by Ariel S. Winter, and whilst it can be read as one book, and I read it in one go, actually comprises of 3 separate novels with 10 years between each one. It's interesting in terms of its style. So it's written, each of the 3 books is written in a different style. So the first book, so set in 1931 and set in France, is written very much in the style of Georges Simenon, who wrote the Maigret novels. So that book is called Malvinot Prison, and it is a novel about a series of, so starts with a corpse turning up in a bakery in a small town. There's a large prison outside of the town, and it becomes, as the plot develops, it becomes apparent that there's been a number of violent happenings at the prison and a number of mysterious deaths. And it's about a kind of teaming up of the local chief of police and a kind of regional inspector who team up to investigate the murders. The second book, which is set in 1941, is Fallen Star, and that's set in Hollywood, and is about a kind of PI who's hired to shadow the female star of a movie that's being made because she's worried that she's being followed by someone. So this one, written very much in the style of the Philip Marlowe novels by Raymond Chandler. So it's real kind of hard-boiled detective fiction. And as you'd expect, there's a few deaths in there. And, you know, the plot kind of expands far beyond the scope that the PI involved originally imagines it will do. So quite different from the first book, not least because the first book, so Malvinot Prison, is written in the 3rd person. The second one is written in the 1st person, as befits a Chandler homage. And actually that transition from one to the other kind of took me by surprise at first. I knew that the books were set in different time periods, but going into The 20-Year Death, I didn't know that there were such distinct styles to each one. So I kind of twigged reading the first one that it was in the kind of Simenon style, but it quickly became apparent as I started the second one that was in the Chandler style. And it's an interesting take on crime fiction. And when I get to the differences between the books at the end, I'll talk a bit more about how successful I thought it was. The third book then, which is called Police at the Funeral, is written in the style of Jim Thompson, who's a writer I really admire. Not that I don't admire Simon or Chandler. I certainly, I like all three of the writers. And this one is around, so set in 51, about a kind of washed up writer who gets involved in a very noirish plot involving an inheritance and once again some unexplained deaths or certainly unexpected deaths, shall we say. And there's a kind of femme fatale character in that one as well, who's winding him up to do stuff. So again, an interesting take on adopting the style of another writer, and quite successful. And overall, so those three independent novels might sound like they're unrelated, but actually, and I won't spoil it by going into too much detail, but actually there is an overarching story that goes through all three, which I thought worked pretty well. So it's not apparent until you get a bit of the way into the second book exactly what that overarching story is going to be, and it develops as you go. And I thought it was interesting and it worked pretty well. 5 Decembers then, by contrast, has more of an obvious continuing plot. So 5 Decembers starts in December 1941, set in Hawaii. So the opening of it is in Hawaii, and it's about a police detective who's investigating a mysterious death. So he gets called out to a kind of remote farm to investigate the murder. Initially it appears of one person. He quickly discovers it's actually a murder of two people. And it turns out that one of the corpses has ties to the military. So being set in December 1941, or I think that it starts at the end of November, as you might have guessed, it has ties to Pearl Harbor. And the plot as it develops turns into as much of a war story and indeed a romance as it is a detective story. So the opening is very much in the kind of hard-boiled detective style, but as it develops into a war story, it gets a very different feel. And whereas it's effectively much like the 20-Year Death, it's very much in three parts. So the first part is, as I say, proper detective stuff. The middle part is much more of a war story, and this, from the kind of elapsed time of the book perspective, is quite an elongated section, albeit it doesn't take up really much more time than the other two parts of the book. Is very much a war story and set in Asia. And then the final part of the book, and again, I don't want to get into spoilers too much because it's a fantastic book and deserves to be read, but gets more into that kind of hard-boiled detective style again. So that's hopefully given you a flavour for the two books in terms of kind of plot. And as I've said, the 20-Year Death very much written in the style of the three writers that I've mentioned, whereas 5 Decembers has more of its own style, but definitely draws on the kind of hard-boiled style particularly, but also that kind of classic war novel style. And I'm thinking about writers, it reminded me a bit of kind of James Clavell, who wrote a number of books, historical novels set at various points in time, set in Asia. So it's got kind of quite a classic epic feel to it. And I think the extended time window, so that kind of 4-year period that it's set over, certainly helps to give it that kind of lush, expansive feel. It has much more of a wide, as I say, epic feel than you'd expect from a hard-boiled crime novel. So hopefully that's given you a flavour for the kind of plots and moods of the two books. What I want to get into now is really my analysis of how well that works. So I've talked a bit about similarities and differences. For me, the main difference between the books was that the 20-Year Death feels like what it is, which is an experiment in style. So don't get me wrong, it does work as a story, and that overarching story actually hangs together pretty well. but it feels like someone who knows about crime fiction writing wanting to write a book that tries out different styles, and that's the overwhelming sense I took from it. So I really enjoyed it as a book, but it feels a bit showy. It reminded me a lot of kind of Tarantino movies, in that you often feel like he's as a director, he's playing around and trying things out rather, more than telling a story. And that was the sense I got from the 20-Year Death. But it does work, it in the same way that Tarantino's movies work as movies, it does work as a book, and I really enjoyed it, and for me it was a 4-star read. But that switching of styles means that you never really get a sense of what Ariel Winter's own style is, and the story therefore doesn't have the same emotional connection that it might have done otherwise. So for me, it constantly felt like the style got in the way of me developing a real connection with the characters. So I did give it 4 stars. I think it's I think what it sets out to do, it does very successfully, but it didn't grab my heart in the way that some books do. And whilst there are definitely similarities between the two books, 5 Decembers did grab my heart. So 5 Decembers, has, definitely draws on the style of previous works, but not to the extent that the 20-Year Death does. And I felt that James Kestrel, did have his own voice in the book. And I certainly developed, an emotional connection with the main character in the book, the detective, and also, a number of the ancillary characters that were in the book. So Kestrel does a great job of introducing other characters, some of whom end up being in the book for quite a time, some of whom are only in it briefly. But he has that knack of helping you to, making you feel like the character and can relate to them and can feel sympathy for them. He can do that in very few pages, and he does it a number of times in the book really well. So, being a war novel, there are some terrible things that he writes about in the book, and you feel that emotional connection. Whereas, the 20-Year Death, while some really horrible things happen in it, I never had quite as much connection with the characters as I did in 5 Decembers. So for that reason, for me, 5 Decembers was a more successful book, and I gave it 5 stars as opposed to the 4 that I gave the 20-Year Death. So it's I think 5 Decembers is a really excellent book. I think the 20-Year Death, I love the story in the 20-Year Death, and I love the way that he takes these 3 separate parts of the story and manages to tie them together. And I didn't have a problem with the 10-year gap between the different stories works really well. It was just that style thing that I think held the book back from being great. When I look back at the events and think about the characters and things, it feels like a bit of an emotional roller coaster. But when I was actually reading it, I didn't get that, it didn't grab me in the same way, whereas 5 Decembers really did. So, of the 2 books, if I was to recommend one, I would recommend 5 Decembers. But actually, I think they're both really worth reading. If you're a fan of crime fiction, particularly if you're a fan of kind of crime fiction with a bit of history thrown in, then they're both worth reading. 5 Decembers does that history thing a bit better, but there's some lovely, kind of period detail in the 20-Year Death, which I think you'd really enjoy. So, both books definitely get a thumbs up from me. 5 Decembers would be my pick of the 2 if I had to make one. So, as always, hope you've enjoyed that video. If you like crime, if you like pulp, if you like horror, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. I try and get a couple of videos up every week, so hopefully there'll always be some new content up soon that will interest you. But as always, good to talk to you. Hope you've enjoyed things. Let me know in the comments if you read either of the books and what your thoughts on them were. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Cheerio.